ran into an interesting scenario at work today. You want to hear about it?
Sure.
I figure we better just, lighten the mood before we dig into the episode here. But, so I've been trying this new health thing because, trying to eat a little healthier. And my main thing is whenever I'm going for snacks, I want to eat snacks that I can look on the back of the packaging and, know how to pronounce all the ingredients of. I feel like that's a sign of me getting a little bit older.
Oh, I thought you were legitimately doing an intro bit. Is that you're really doing that?
Well, yeah, actually, I am really doing that. And because with my old age, I just have one question though.
What's that?
I don't know what is hip anymore.
You know why?
Why?
Because you haven't been smoking the best weed, brother.
Welcome back, everybody. That was very nice, man.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody, to the best music podcast on this side of the Mississippi, hosted by two dashingly good-looking men who share the same middle name. I am the one, the only, the never gonna smoke weed in my lifetime, Ryan James Kearns.
And I am the one, the only, the undisputed, the I actually don't smoke weed either. That was just a joke based on what we're about to talk about today, Matthew James Durzik.
And this podcast is called Hey Listen to This. And if this is your very first time tuning into what this podcast is, first of all, on behalf of me and Matthew, the other person who doesn't smoke weed here on this podcast, I want to welcome you. Secondly, what we do here is we take turns picking albums that we want to dissect track by track, and it could be for a couple different reasons. It could be something as hey, I legitimately want the other person on the on this podcast to experience this album, or it could be maybe I've heard some hype about this album, maybe we should check it out. Or, hey, this is a completely new thing for us, so let's explore together. So, last week, we discussed the 2022 album by Gang of Youth called Angel in Real Time. And, while I was a little bit higher on the review, Matt, I was, glad that you at least enjoyed the album as a whole, that you didn't walk away from it being is Ryan having a stroke or something?
No, I did enjoy the album, and I think that it definitely was probably one of the more interesting experiences I have had listening to newer music, because again, I didn't like everything off the album, but it was definitely something that I could appreciate for its strong storytelling and occasionally very good instrumental backing.
So, if you've not checked out that episode yet, that review, after you get done with this episode, it's the episode that's right next in line on the podcasting platform of choice that you're currently listening to this on. So, treat yourself to even more about me and Matt talking about music and the music that we want to appreciate and our thoughts about that as a whole. Matt, what do we got going on this week, though?
So this week we are jumping back 49 years from the last album we talked about, from 2022 to 1973. And we're going to be talking about the third album by the band Tower of Power, called Tower of Power, named after the band. And this band is kind of seen as the outlier, or the... I wouldn't want to say hipster choice, but definitely not as popular of a horn-based band compared to their peers, particularly Blood, Sweat, and Tears and Chicago. And they did get a little bit of a later start. I think they didn't release their first album until 1970 or 1971, while the other two had already released albums by that point. Plus, they were out on the West Coast, and their first couple albums really didn't have too many big, quote-unquote, hit songs. This one didn't really either, but we'll get to that. The point being, I remember listening to a long time ago, and there were a few choice songs that I remember liking quite a bit. So I was digging through the CDs the other day, reorganizing my house a little bit, or the house I live in, rather, and came across this, and was like, oh, haven't heard this in a while. I know there's one good song off of it. So I gave it a listen. I was like, oh, okay. And here we are.
So, yeah, whenever you said that we were going to cover this this band at the end of last week's review, I was just like, oh, okay, legitimately never heard of them. And, you know me, especially when we had that Jellyfish review, I'm always willing to, dive into an album, head first, because, you never know what you can find. And also, shout out to that episode, that review. If you've not listened to that episode, it was a great episode that we recorded about a month or so ago. I forget the actual timeline, but I mean, if you've not heard of Jellyfish, go check out that review. Go check out that album. Spoiler alert: me and Matt both like the album, but you got to figure out why. And yeah. I mean, not much more of an introduction that we need to do with this album, this artist as a whole. So, you ready to kick it off with the first track off the album?
Yes, the first track off the album is What Is Hip, and I'll let you go first on this one.
Oh, okay. So, my introduction, my first, spin through this album was it came at a very good time, and when I needed, a good pick-me-up. And I was at the end of a very hard run. My legs felt like spaghetti, and I was just like, you know what? I'm gonna try to kick it up a notch. I'm gonna try for the last 6 minutes of this run to actually really put a good effort in. So this was the first track off the album that I got introduced to, and it came at a moment where I needed a good pick me up, and needless to say, it does a really good job with that. I mean, the way that this song is constructed, it's a song and a style that's not really in my wheelhouse, where the primary focus is more on the instrumentation and the horns and how the interplay and the overall feel of it. Because if you are looking into this track and the rest of this album as a whole for the lyrical meaning of it, and sparsing out bars that are really tight, you're not going to find it here. This is more about performance. This is more about overall feel, and if this can get you going, and this track does it to a T. I mean, this song, even right out of the gate, it has a solid intro. I love that running bass and the horns coming in at random bursts. The call and response with the vocals and the horns are great, dude. I love how they are just as important, or if not more important than the vocals, like I said. The random, I don't know if I would call them, solos or anything like that, but the random features of, the trumpet, guitar, and the organ, that's also very solid. And, I mean, I'm just going to come out of the gate and say it. This is my favorite track off the album. And I know that this is probably one of their most popular tracks because when I went on their Spotify page, their artist pick was this track itself.
Deservedly so. Before I get into my thoughts, I just want to name off some names here, and that is the members of the band. Lenny Williams on lead vocals, Chester Thompson on organ, Bruce Conti on guitar and backing vocal, Thompson also on backing vocal, Rocco Prestia on bass, David Garibaldi on drums, Brent Byers on congas, or bongos in this case, Stephen Kupka on saxophone and backing vocals, Lenny Pickett on clarinet, flute, first tenor backing vocal, Mick Gillette on trombone and trumpet, along with baritone horn, flugelhorn, Amelia Castillo on second tenor, Greg Adams on trumpet and flugelhorn, and all those gentlemen also have backing vocals. The reason I bring up those names is because every single one of them on this track performs to a level of perfection. It is utter perfection. This is also my favorite track on the album by a country mile. I really just think this is one of the best R&B songs I've ever heard. Particularly the trio of Garibaldi, Prestia, and Byers. Like you said, that incessant rhythmic pulse of the bass, the bongos, and the drums are just absolutely perfect. The horns come in at the perfect times. I really can't say anything else other than, well, I'll say a few other things. First of all, I would say that the lyrics, honestly, are probably very good too, especially compared to some of the other songs we're going to talk about on the album. And again, just to me, this song in and of itself is a 10 out of 10. No notes. It's just fantastic.
It is absolutely the chef's kiss.
Yes.
So talking about the lyrics, one thing that I did appreciate, like, what they brought to the table, and what Lenny Williams, who's the lead singer, he did a very good job, like, bringing his stuff to the vocals and the lyrics as a whole. It's basically exploring, like, hey, somebody who wants to change up their life, but, they want to do something that they feel like is going to be the hip thing. But ultimately what the message is, at least what I walked away from it, was, hey, what's hip today might become passé. So it might be this whole track as a statement might be more of like, hey, just be yourself, just enjoy what you bring to the table, and that's good enough. And just other moments that I really did appreciate here. And you, like, the moment that I'm going to highlight, you can hear in like a couple different tracks off this album here, but like I really did appreciate like the staccato notes that could be heard throughout the track. Like, those horn hits, they were so tight. The build up at the end is super solid with the repetition of just a simple lick, but it sucks you in to what the track has to bring to the table.
The outro to this track is so good. It builds so well. Again, just sort of, it comes down after that last horn that you think is going to be the end of it. Then it goes that little sort of organ solo that goes on for a little before the vocals come back in. And then, it just builds. Like, at first just bongos, then Garibaldi comes in with the drums and he starts going on. Then he hits that ride cymbal at the very end. And it just, the way it ends with that, with the horns just hitting every single note, the exact right time in that last thing. Like, I've listened to this song probably a dozen times in the last, 5 days, and it keeps getting better every time. And it really upsets me to say, you mentioned how... I'm glad. I'm glad that Spotify chose this as, the top song in regards to what Tower of Power is, because I think they're right. But back when this album came out, that wasn't the case. It barely cracked the Hot 100, getting all the way to number 91. Which is a real damn shame, because this track is so good. And if it had gotten as high enough to, have Casey Kasem be like, and here from, Oakland, California, it's Tower of Power, this song could have gone even higher and higher and higher, and it never got that opportunity, which, again, is a real shame. But in the context of this album, easily, far and away, my number one track.
So, the next track.
And the next track is Clever Girl. Not as good as What Is Hip, but that's not really saying too much. Honestly, I've kind of flirted a little bit with calling this my least favorite, but I can't in good conscience do that. It's a fine song. It basically talks about how, this dude is dealing with a girl who thinks she's, the hot stuff, and then all of a sudden, things fall apart. I mean, lyrically, there's not a whole lot home to write about. And performance-wise, there really isn't a whole lot either. Again, it sounds fine, but there's two things on this track that kind of drag it down for me. One is letting the group as a whole, the backup vocalist in this band, sing the chorus. I didn't think that was a great move because it just kind of lets the biggest moment of the song kind of peter out. And secondly, the mixing on the vocals on both sides just doesn't make any sense because the vocals for the band sound sort of reverberated like they were on the previous track, but Lenny Williams' vocals don't. They sound very dry and very almost first run through, which it's not the worst sounding thing in the world, but that just kind of, I just sort of was listening. I thought, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? But it sounds good enough that it avoids being my least favorite track on the album. And for the record, I have a top 2 on this album. Yeah, I have a top 2 and a bottom 1. That's it.
Oh, okay. So I have a top 3, and no, I made a new rule when reviewing albums going forward here. So like how I told you, like in my head and like in my notations, I've individually rated songs, and it helps me calculate a proper score for the album.
Yeah.
So any track that doesn't fall below a 7 out of 10 for me, I'm not going to say it's a least favorite track, because like in my head, like that's still a good track. But at the end of the day, like I feel like it's short-sighted to me, and it's like I'm doing it for more ceremony than anything with naming a least favorite track. If the whole album as a complete package, like there's not one single track that falls below that 7 out of 10 mark. So that is found nowhere throughout the rest of the album here. That being said, though, getting back to Clever Girl here, I didn't really catch the different mixing issues that you were talking about, and like how the background vocals didn't really add to the chorus as a whole. Like I felt like this song here was solid enough. I mean, it's pretty straightforward with its approach. I mean, it's a very smooth, like soulful ballad. One thing that I noted here, and it's going to come up with like the rest of the album and the track listing. I'm a sucker for an album that has proper sequencing, and I feel like again, they might not have been thinking about this when they released the album, but like the messaging and like the flow of everything, it just seems a little bit disjointed. It's just like we go from what is hip, like this fast-paced, like oh hey, like this is like a good funk song and like a really great horn song, to Clever Girl, which is like we're bringing the tempo way back down. We're going back into a smooth R&B ballad, and then we're talking about like this Clever Girl who this track almost feels like a semi diss track in terms of like, hey, this one girl is just so bloody awful to the subject of the song. And then the next track, I mean, just gonna peek ahead a little bit. It's called This Time It's Real, and like oh hey, I met this girl and everything's okay. I'll point out several instances more where the sequencing gets a little weird for me. But I mean, if that was really a problem for me, I could just make a playlist of this album and properly sequence it how I see fit. But a random little nerdy thing that I wanted to point out, but. Like, other moments here that I appreciated off of Clever Girl here is that the instrumentation, where like with the intro, with how those horns are blaring and setting the tone for the track, and then you have the keys that are doing like a running up and down thing, creating a nice cascading effect. I felt like that was a nice touch. And the horns are doing a great job here with different moments that I was able to find out, where it almost seems like they're responding to and matching and contrasting the vocals in such a solid fashion. So they're not doing one singular job. They're almost like their own beast, and it's just like sometimes we're gonna compliment, sometimes we're gonna be an answer in our own vocals, and then sometimes we're gonna be off and doing our own thing. I felt like that was a great thing here, man.
Yeah, I don't think this is a bad track by any means. Again, just a couple of nitpicks about it. But as far as you saying that it kind of just, again, it's like a cold splash of water to the face compared to what Is Hip was, I think you're dead on money. I do think juxtaposition is going to play a big factor on the rest of the album, particularly in the again, I know you talk about like lyrical sequencing or just thematic sequencing. This album doesn't really have a whole lot of that. This is more or less just a let's call it a collection of songs, if you will.
So the next track is This Time It's Real. And we picked the tempo back up with this track here, and it has a really good swinging feel, and the band has nice moments where the horns hit. Another simple and straightforward track, but I really did like what it had what it brought to the table. Overall, though, we get the horns are adding different offbeat hits. I mean, that's what we found in What Is Hip, and that's a great moment in my opinion. And one thing that I took away that was just a unique feeling for me, and This Time It's Real, is just how carefree the band sounds during the chorus. I felt like that was a nice touch. The background vocals here and the main vocals are playing off each other, and the band during the outro, all three elements there, the background vocals, the main vocals, and the band playing together in the outro is a very nice touch. Overall, though, it's a very straightforward, swinging, soulful kind of song, and I really dug it. It didn't land in my top three, though.
It came very close to landing in my top three for many of the same reasons you discussed. The horns do sound carefree. The entirety of the song has a very sunny, almost post-Motown kind of breeziness to it that I really, really liked. It almost sounds like the theme to like a TV show from the 70s, honestly. Like you just see like opening credits of, some stars you may have never heard of before playing, over top of that. But what kept it on my top three, though, unfortunately, again, this is a bit of a minor nitpick, and realistically, you could point this out for a lot of, if not all, tracks on the album, the lyrics. And again, I'm not expecting necessarily, Joni Mitchell or Bob Dylan or Leonard Cohen to walk in through the door and be like, these, poet savant atop these, very funky rhythms. But something about, the part that sort of kept it out of the top three for me was the start of the second verse where Lenny's just thinking about, all these girls that were basically just waste of my time. And to sing that in such a sunny manner and then also come back with, you're the all-star of my life. I'm just like, my eyes were rolling to the point where if I had put them on the ground, I could actually do the speed limit with my eyes. So again, this song is good. I will say this song is good. I like it. But it's not in my top three because, again, it just feels a little too dated for me.
Fair enough, man. I love that metaphor that you used. That was absolutely hilarious, man.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, not much else to say about the track as a whole. So, yeah, I felt like there were several moments off of this album that the lyrics were really, really surface level. I didn't really dig a little too far into them, and I don't know if I notated it in one of the later tracks, but there was one track specifically that I couldn't find the lyrics of anywhere on the internet. Yeah, I tried. There was 3 tracks on Genius that said missing lyrics. So I was able to backdoor some of that because, the power of Google. But, there was one track specifically that I'm like, well, I guess I'm just here for the vibes, man.
Yeah, and again, I think that's kind of the curse of Tower of Power is, again, that it's such a relic of the 70s that, the desire to find information about them now is relegated to, a certain select few people, and it turns out we are 2 of them, it seems. So are you ready to move on to Will I Ever Find a Love?
Oh, I am ready to move on to Will I Ever Find Love. And I think it's your turn to kick off the track here.
It is my turn. And I'm just going to come out and say it. I think this is the best of the ballads on the album. I really love how the track starts with the horns, connecting once again in unison to present this, opening, and then it just kind of backs off with the trumpet just doing its own thing for a few seconds before Lenny Williams comes in. And really, Lenny does do the most of the muscle work on this track. His vocals are fantastic. They ebb and flow wonderfully. The verses sound like verses. And even on the chorus where his vocals don't lift so much, the band lifts it up for him. And it just, again, the notion of, this band being a horn-based band, you might hear and think, oh, it's just, a typical R&B song, but I feel like there's a certain discipline displayed on this track and of course, on what is hip, that is very present, even in the simpler moments whenever they're getting out of the chorus and back into the main riff that starts the song. The little fills that Garibaldi does to push that, and even Prestia's bass, which does its job and then just sort of pulses when it has to. I think this is a fantastic track, and it is my second favorite off of the album.
So, I'm not nearly as high on this track as you are, but that being said, it's still a very good track. I will say, though, I had mixed feelings on Williams' vocals here, because there was moments where he does sound really good and really on point, and he's really delivering a very soulful ballad that you can really believe the messaging that he's bringing to the table. But there's also moments where I feel like his vocals are either not mixed efficiently well, or it just seems like he kind of sounds maybe a little flat at some points. Overall, though, I do really like the track. The band complements the whole track very well. I love how they play with dynamics throughout the track, and the grounding lick that they do, where it's like duh, duh, duh. I felt like that's a very nice touch. And I mean, again, the way that the band swells up during the one moment that I want to highlight is the way that the band swells up during the section where Lenny sings about finding a girl, finding love. That's a very great touch, because throughout several albums and several reviews of this podcast that we have here, I'm always a sucker for when the emotional intensity that is being delivered by the lyrics and the vocals is being matched by what's backdropping them on a sonic landscape. So I felt like those two met well together. Overall, though, if it wasn't for Lenny missing some of the notes and how he fell a little bit flat. This could easily probably crack my top 3, dude.
I understand what you're saying about the vocals. My only argument would be, I think, and maybe I'm reading a little too much in this, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's a podcast and that's what we do here, is that I feel like the sort of flatness, and I kind of feel the same way about Springsteen in a sense, is that the sort of rawness of it, or the folksiness of the vocals, sort of lends itself to the listener, because I think, a lot of people do struggle with, finding love, and, obviously music has been one of the best ways to convey such emotions. And I feel like, again, and I know it's kind of hard to argue, the vocals are supposed to sound somewhat flat to, direct more to the common listener, when A, this was not a hit, and B, the horns don't have that leeway. But yeah, I understand what you're saying, but still, I dig the song a lot, and it's going to stay at number 2 for me.
Fair enough. I mean, I don't want to chase a rabbit down the hole here, talking about, further along that subject, because I feel like you and I can even slide into another episode within this episode here, dude. All right, so the next track is Get Your Feet Back on the Ground, and I'm gonna kick this one off if you don't mind.
Go for it.
So, dude, this is a great song that showcases the band a little bit more. The solo section that's featured here, and it's actually a proper solo section, I really, really loved it. It was a highlight off the track for me in the album as a whole. And that funky beat that is featured in that solo section, along with those horn hits, make for a very great time. Like, this track, I feel like when I think about my experience with listening to Tower of Power, like, it's tracks like this that really bring up the experience, bring up the band as a whole for me. Like, not that the other tracks that we've discussed so far are subpar, or well, technically I guess they're subpar in comparison, but not that they're poor tracks. Like, if it was a whole album like just with those tracks, I mean, I would still have a good time, but this brings it up a notch for me mentally, and I always appreciate a good solid solo section. So a little bit more about the track as a whole. The way that the track kicks off, it has such a nice, great feel that features this funky little lick that is repeated twice, and the second time, like, there's more horns that are added in, and I thought that was a great way to set the table for the track as a whole. The beat in the first verse has a great funky feel to it, featuring guitar, bass, and drums, with you almost get the guitar curling up to notes at moments, and I felt like that was a great touch. Yeah, like I said, the solo section is great. I love that, and the call and response portion of the vocals at the end is a very fun part. And we've arrived at my second favorite track off this album here.
That doesn't surprise me, and I totally get that, because basically my notes of this, or at least my thoughts of this, are very similar to yours, with a couple of exceptions. I think this is basically a diet version of what is hip, honestly. The rhythm is very much the same, the pulse is very much the same, but it didn't just really hit as much as it didn't with what is hip, honestly. Not to say this is a bad track, I do like this track too. But you mentioned the solo. Was that the guitar solo you were talking about?
Yes.
Okay. Because unfortunately that was my one nitpick with this particular song. And before I explain why, I will just sort of peek back the curtains here, or, peek back behind the curtains, that I listened to this album on CD. Now, it feels like whatever old albums that have been converted into digital or, streaming quality, it feels like there has been masters and remasters and remasters or remasters of the remasters. So this may depend on your listening experience. So, platform may have a certain, dictation in this. So mine might have been a little less remastered. The point, what I'm trying to say is, I thought the guitar solo kind of sounded like ass. Not from a instrumental perspective, but from a mixing perspective. It sounded... The one time I listened to it, it sounded like it was too high in the mix. The second time I listened to it, it sounded fine. And the third time I listened to it, it sounded like tinny and sort of like almost recorded like through like a tin can almost. So, again, a kind of a minor nitpick with a lot of explanation, as it turns out. But I like this track too. Did not land in my top two. And realistically, a lot of these tracks that we're talking about, possibly being in the top three, there were so many of them that I was just like, I can't choose one, so I'm not going to make a top three. Top two, and that's it.
Fair enough. So while you were, giving your explanation for why you didn't like that guitar solo section, I quickly hopped onto, Spotify, and I checked to see if the recording that I was listening to was like a remastered version. It was not. But one thing that I did do, though, is whenever, like, going forward, whenever I'm listening to albums for, like, when I'm doing the detailed listening for, like, this show that we are literally on right now, I am going to use my Sony earbuds that have a little bit more of a higher quality of sound. Like, they take, like, they have this feature where they can bring certain, like, audio files and, like, take it up a notch in terms of give it a little bit more audio clarity. So that might have had something to do with it. I don't know. I mean, maybe if I just play it out of my phone speaker, or like even just on my Google Pixel Buds, and re-examine that solo, I'm curious to see what if my thoughts about it would change. But as it stands right now, my experience walking away from the track and the solo as a whole was a great highlight for me. Yeah, and getting back into this song here more specifically, again, lyrically, not much here other than Lenny sounding really soulful while singing lines about how this girl needs to get her crap together. And it's funny that, so, in our journey of, like, sequencing throughout this album here, we go from Will I Ever Find Love, which is like, oh, yeah, no, I want love, I'm so lonely, to, like, get your feet back on the ground, but like, girl, get your crap together. And then the next track is So Very Hard to Go, which is like, oh, I know I should leave, but it's so hard to go. Like, it's almost like, I know like this album as a whole is more of a collection of songs instead of like, a properly sequenced piece of work. But in my head, I'm still going to notate the rest of it because I find it a little bit amusing.
It is amusing, and again, I feel like, and granted, thematically it's one thing, but there's also something to be said about the sonic juxtaposition of everything, but I'll save that argument for later. But are you ready to move on to So Very Hard to Go?
I mean, it's so very hard to go away from Get Your Feet Back on the Ground, but yeah, I'm ready to roll, man.
You're just making up for that intro I took from you, didn't you?
Yeah. No, when there's a door, I just gotta walk on through.
There you go. So, oddly enough, before I get into my feelings about this song, this was actually the lead single from this album, So Very Hard to Go, and it is actually the highest charting song in the band's history, the only one of their songs to ever crack the top 20, falling at number 17 back in 1973. And I can understand why, because this song's quite good too. It's a little different than, like you said, Get Your Feet Back on the Ground, because not only is it, again, going from confidence to feeling a little weary about your love life, but it also slows the tempo down again. But a lot of the problems I had with Clever Girl are fixed here. I love the way that Lenny's vocals are mixed. And oddly enough, the way the band sounds on the chorus, lifting things up, sounds good too. It does kind of come off a little off-putting at first, but the way they sing reminds me a lot of like Philly soul bands like the Intruders or even the Jaggers. Very much just a good, solid vocal performance. And my one sort of nitpick at first was, you can't really tell if this is like a horn-based band or that this would even be Tower of Power because it sounds generic. But that trumpet solo in this song, it is a great, great solo. Very melodic. Again, not my top 3 just because, again, it's in the dogfight with all the other ones. But I get why this was a hit and I like this song.
I dig this song too. In my head, it's like another, like, soulful ballad. I didn't really have any nitpicks, like, as compared to Will I Ever Find Love, like, in terms of, like, Lenny's vocal performance. Like, here, he sounds super solid. He nailed all the notes here. I love the backdrop that features just the piano, bass, and guitar, and drums during the verses. I feel like, that was a great addition. Instead of bands like this don't always need to bring the funk. Whenever they can show restraint and dial back it and bring that still that passion but in a different format, that's always a good time for me. The chorus has good moments in with the horns coming in along with Lenny sounding soulful. The backup vocals in the chorus are nice as well. I'm always a sucker for call and response dynamics, and the backup vocals work well with that kind of motif. I dug the trumpet solo. I didn't find it as nearly as I didn't dig it nearly as much as you did, but I did appreciate for what it brought to the table. It was a very nice touch. And like overall, very solid song. Lyrically, Lenny is singing about wanting a girl back, even though she has either moved on or, he screwed something up in the relationship. I couldn't really determine by the lyrics one way or another. I felt like it was maybe it might have been a 50-50 split within that relationship.
Yeah. I think this is a solid track. I can understand why it was a hit. And I think that the thematic elements of it, too, are pretty solid. I mean, it does sound a little anonymous at times, but at the same time, it still sounds good. So, no complaints from me. Just solid, good track.
All right. So, are you ready for the next track here?
Yes, the next track, Soul Vaccination.
And can you guess how I feel about this track?
I'm going to say it is somewhere in your top 3 at number 3. Am I close at thinking that?
You hit the nail right on the head.
I knew it.
Beautiful, beautiful man.
You sucker. You sucker for sax solos.
It's funny, like, even in retrospect, like, the tracks that brought everything up as an experience for me were the funky tracks, like, the ones that are really bringing up the energy levels. Not that I didn't mind the other tracks, but like those tracks really stuck out for me, dude.
No disagreement there. I'm wholeheartedly with you. Although, well, I'll let you go first, and then I'll explain my thoughts about this song.
So one thing that I will say, though, with this track here, let me just take a look. Yeah. With this track here, I feel like one nitpick that I do have for Soul Vaccination is that that the backing band during the verses it kind of seems like they're doing maybe a little bit too much, and they almost seem like they're teetering on edge of getting out of pocket. Like, I feel like at times they're either rushing or they just don't mesh well with the horns. Like, they just need to. I feel like there could have been like another take there where they just focused in, maybe got like a click track in their ears. I don't know if that technology existed back then, or if they were like, nope, hey, we're just gonna play it like how we want to, like a live performance. That being said, though, that sax solo that you hinted at whenever we introduced the track here, it's a really good solo, man. It's one of my favorite solos off the album. I would say it's probably my favorite, and the reason why this track doesn't pop up into that second favorite spot is it's just how that backing band felt a little bit off, and like they were kind of doing their own thing, but it didn't mesh well. But another excellent moment for this track here is whenever I hear a Barry sax in a track, my heart soars to high heaven, because it's one of my people. But in terms of that sax solo as a whole, I love how you get like that main horn that comes in, and then the rest of the band plays off each other with different parts coming in and adding a nice funky moment within their own rights. I felt that was a great touch. The call and response with the vocals, the background vocals at moments in this track, they work well with the band. Excellent use of that motif that I'm always a sucker for. Overall, though, it was another great track for me. Lyrically, this is probably the best example of me saying that Lenny is not really the focus here, and he's not really delivering anything in terms of lyrical substance. He's, again, just a tone setter. He's just here to add another instrument to the mix, and the main focus is the band itself.
I slightly disagree with that particular take about Lenny. I mean, the other takes you've been saying so far about the band, I honestly didn't think that they were that out of pocket. I really like the playing on this song a lot. I agree the solos are fantastic. The Barry sax is lovely to hear. The way that Garibaldi, sort of slows down and trickles, that sort of, that does get out of pocket a little bit. I actually dug that quite a bit. My issue with this song, and again, I know it's the 70s, and everything. But man, the lyrics are so corny on this song. I mean, and here's the issue I have with Williams particularly. He's delivering them in a way like, and I know you mentioned him being another instrument, which is a solid analogy, but it comes off too serious for me. Like, you're talking about vaccinating somebody with soul. The lyrics are so corny. I think it would have been better if the whole band, like the band plus the backing vocals, sang everything. Like, not just, the parts that they do sing all together. I'm talking about everything. It could kind of be almost like We Are the World or the Super Bowl Shuffle. Just go full slam on the corny button, and then you kind of roots back around to being, sort of, charming in a sense. But I feel like by presenting in a way that's almost like trying to be akin to like James Brown in a sense, doesn't really work, and that's what kept this pretty far out of the top 3 for me. But again, the playing, I agree with you, is very, 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 very good and worth a listen.
I don't know. I feel like there's a couple moments in this review that we've done so far where I'm just like, the lyrics are not really a focus, and you're like, actually, let's look at the lyrics. And I feel like that's a very interesting dynamic, because usually I'm the one who, like, I mean, even thinking about like our Pearl Jam review like a couple episodes ago, and one of your favorite tracks, I was just like, oh, the lyrics, oh, they're bad. Like, they're so cookie cutter. And I, like, there's not one single way, a right way to review an album and, like, walk away from it, especially in, like, this, like, show that we have here. But I find it interesting, like, at certain points we're almost shifting roles, and we're like almost changing hats depending on like how we approach an album and how we experience it. I thought that was a very interesting moment that I wanted to point out to you, dude.
It's a solid interesting introspection. I agree that we have this sort of dynamic where we'll look at things that the other person doesn't look at. It's like, oh, like, hold on, they might have. Let's hear them out here. But no, again, getting back to Soul Vaccination again. I agree. The up-tempo tracks and the way that the band performs on this track does stick out. And as I kept listening to it, because honestly, this was like in contention from like my least favorite track on the album. But the more I listened to it, even on the first round, I was like, no, the playing's too good. I can't do that to this song. I can't. So it is what it is.
So the next track is
Both Sorry Over Nothing.
And I'm gonna let you leave this one off, dude.
All right. This song tends to go back again. We're just bouncing back and forth throughout this entire album from up-tempo track, ballad, up-tempo track, ballad, up-tempo track, ballad, up-tempo track, another ballad. But this one has a bit more of a kick to it. Falls more in the territory closer, I would say, to This Time It's Real, except it doesn't swing. It's very straightforward, straight 4/4 beat. And it really wasn't until the third time I listened to it where I was like, actually, this song's quite good too. Because even though the lyrics are pretty mundane and, it's not really a song to write home about, the band sounds good. Lenny Williams sounds good. The harmonies sound good. It's not really funky, but as far as it being a solid R&B ballad, I liked it. I think this was, again, one of the more sort of underrated songs on the album. Not my top 3 or top 2, but I liked it.
So, remember how I couldn't find a lyric sheet to, look over while I was listening to, this album here for a certain track?
Was this it?
This was it. I did actually notate it because, like, at the very end of my notes on this track here, I'm like, I can't really tell you what Lenny's doing lyrically because I couldn't find the lyrics, but everything sounds fine.
Yeah.
But the way that I felt about the track, it's a good track. I mean, I did like you. I like what the band was bringing to the table. I really dug the flow of the track with how it feels like it bounces within moments. I felt like that was a good thing that it brought to the table. Lenny here is just sounding pretty good alongside the band, who's being driven what I feel like so for a majority of the tracks on this album, we are getting him driven when it comes to like horns, like trumpet, saxophone. But I felt like here it was almost like a trombone kind of focus, which was a very nice touch for me. And I liked the ending. The ending was good with how the band was just doing a riffing section. I felt like that was a good way to show what the band can bring to the table. Overall, the way that I walked away from the track, decent enough track. Obviously, it didn't land in my top three. Because we've already ran out of tracks for that because of math, and I literally already said 1, 2, 3. But overall, both Sorry Over Nothing, good track. Really no nitpicks about it. Maybe if I could find some lyric sheets, I could actually maybe dissect it a little bit more. But overall, I remember walking away from it and being like, it's decent.
Agreed. It's really, again, not much of a standout track, but it when you're listening to this album, it sounds good, and even on itself, it sounds good.
Yeah, like when I'm saying throughout a couple, at this point we only have about 2 more tracks left, and we've experienced the Tower of Power, the unlimited power of Tower of Power, but when I'm saying a lot of these tracks are decent and good, they sound good in their own right. They are good, pleasant experiences. Like there's nothing else to there's not really any nitpicks I can have about what it brings to the table. It's just it's a good sounding track. I had a good time listening to it. It's just there were not enough moments that really took it over the edge as compared to the top 3 tracks. But anyways, pivoting on to the rest of the album, because we only have 2 more tracks left. And the next track is Clean Slate. And, sometimes I feel like I need a clean slate, man. But, I felt like I needed that after the Pearl Jam review. But I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole again. Also, shout out to that review if you, want to check out that episode. Me and Matt talked about the new Pearl Jam album, Dark Matter. So, yeah, that was a review. But with Clean Slate here. Overall, really good track. The band is doing a good job sounding so tight with the horns playing well with just the rhythm section of the band. I felt like there was a great touch. The intro with the soulful haze and the staccato upbeats by the horns that we've talked about in a couple tracks off this album here, they set the tone for the song so decently well. And one thing that I noticed here that I didn't give enough credit for in terms of the rest of the album here is that the bass work here specifically, I really dug what it was doing in this track, and the piano player as well. He was doing a good job bringing the thunder. I felt that was a great performance there. And shout out to the bass player, because there was a couple moments I didn't specifically either bring up vocally in this review or even notate it, but I do remember the bass player bringing very a lot of great lines. And sometimes it's easy for a bass player to get lost in the mix, and their job is just to lay the foundation. But whenever you notice them doing something a little bit more and laying a more elaborate foundation, I always make sure to give time for a good bass performance, man.
Rocco Prestia is fantastic throughout the entirety of this album, even when he doesn't stand out. There's never a part where you're just oh, the bass is just kind of not good. It's good throughout the album, and at moments it's great, and this is one of those tracks. I think what I took away from this song is that it's basically in the same form as the likes of What Is Hip or Get Your Feet Back on the Ground. It's not as good as What Is Hip, but it's more original, I would say, than Feet. Again, the piano playing is fantastic. The horns are fantastic. Lenny sounds good. Fun fact, I actually heard, when I was listening to this album and I caught the first part of it, I was like, wait, I've heard this before, and then I remembered. There's an old snippet I have of WDV Radio, local radio station in Pittsburgh, from 1976. that was actually advertising for Tower of Power coming to Pittsburgh, and this was a song they used for the advertising. I was like, oh, it's that one. So that was kind of a interesting little side note there. But aside from that, I pretty much agree with what you're saying. Sounds fine, good, solid. Kind of sounds standard, but it's a good standard based on what they presented.
Yeah, this Clean Slate does sound really, really good. I don't know if I actually talked about the lyrics here, but again, not much really to write home about. Lenny's just saying he just wants a clean slate, and I don't know if the sequencing on this was actually a nod to like how crazy Lenny's life has been. But that being said, he probably having Clean Slate come right before Just Another Day, where like that track, I feel like before we even really dive into it, I feel like it wraps up a couple of themes off the album pretty well. I feel like this was a great way to kick off part one of a part two finale off this album for me.
All right. So moving on to the final track, which is, as you mentioned, Just Another Day.
So I'm going to let you leave this one off because I think I did a Clean Slate, the introduction there.
You did. Okay, so I'll take Just Another Day. And we have run out of tracks, so I'm just going to come out and say this is my least favorite track on the album. Yeah, your hand over your heart is like, why would you say such a thing?
I was actually going to do a trombone noise, but never mind.
Yeah. I was gonna say, if anyone's gonna do that noise, it's me. But all joking aside, honestly, this track isn't even that bad. It sounds fine, but it's just we use the term nothing burger, and this is the nothingest of the nothing burgers on this album. You can't even really tell that there's horns in this band on this track. I mean, you do hear the clarinet do that little motif that they basically ripped off from Chicago off of Introduction. And it's not really that much of a rip-off considering it's just like a little motif that seems like it's been in music forever. But it just feels like this song betrays any type of promise that the band had on Clean Slate or What Is Hip or even Soul Vaccination. It just sounds like an R&B song that could have been done by anyone. Like if you played this for a random person and gave them 10 guesses as to what band this was, they'd probably fail because you can't tell based off of this track that it's a horn-based band called Tower of Power from Oakland, California. You would just think, oh, it's an R&B song from the 70s. Cool. Sounds nice. Moving on.
Okay. So, obviously, I feel like I'm a little bit higher on this track than you are. That kind of, I mean, it didn't crack my top three, but, I didn't have too many nitpicks off of there, off this track. I kind of have mixed feelings about the not including the horns and making it a little bit more identifiable, like you were saying at the end of your discussion there. At some points I feel like it's good enough, like the track itself is good enough to stand on its own, but you're kind of right where it was missing that kind of little extra push to maybe make it a little bit more solid. The clarinet little part, I kind of dug, but it did sound very familiar to me, and I mean, thanks to you, you kind of pointed out why, because it's been used, countless amount of times. But overall, though, the one section here that I want to highlight, the instrumental breaks with the guitar soloing, briefly with the band riffing and the piano doing that cascading effect, I felt like that worked well. The outro with the background vocals and the main vocals riffing and the piano riffing alongside the band sends the track and the album out on a decent note. Lyrically, you have Lenny singing lyrics that wrap up a couple themes that you've experienced throughout the whole album, like loneliness and just experiencing life. But the more I think about it, it is a little bit of a downer track because it's more of here's the period at the end of the album. There's not much else other than, hey, we've reached the end, everybody. This is it.
We have fulfilled the contractual obligation to put 10 songs on this album to be released by Columbia Records.
So, but overall, though, I'm walking away from this track here with a decent feeling in my heart, but I totally respect, 100% respect the opinion that you had that, like, this is basically a nothing burger. Like, you could have, replace the artist name with, like, any other R&B soulful act of around this time, and it could have fit just as perfectly. So, yeah, that's how I feel about Just Another Day.
Yep, just another song.
Just another review, man.
But you know what?
What?
We did it.
We did it, man. We discovered what a tower of power feels like when you have unlimited power with your ability to discuss such an album across the podcast sphere.
We climbed that tower of power.
And I'm going to go first with my overall, feelings off the album and, my overall score. So, when we kicked off this review, you were saying that Tower of Power is not a well-known act, as compared to, their contemporaries, their peers. And I feel like if anybody is a fan of music and a fan of us even more specifically and what we like and what we look for in music, this is a group and this is an artist that you need to check out. Just to, broaden your musical horizons. There's a reason why this album was brought to the table by Matt here. It was something that caught his ear. Tracks like What Is Hip, it's a great bloody track. And there's countless amount of tracks here. Not countless, but there is a good bit of tracks here that bring their own style and their own substance to the table. Obviously, I'm a fan of the more up-tempo tracks like What Is Hip, Soul Vaccination, and Get Your Feet Back on the Ground. Those are great tracks in my opinion. A lot of the other tracks, they sound good. They don't bring enough to the table to push it over the edge. But the way that I'm walking away from this review is that it was a good album for me. I had a great time. Something definitely still not within my wheelhouse because again, I've never really listened to music like this more than the occasional, oh hey, I'm gonna check out the Chicago album. That being said, my overall rating on this album here is going to be a solid 7 out of 10.
I'm glad you appreciated the album. Again, I know it's not in your wheelhouse and, not necessarily in your time period either because I tend to have the, nature of reviewing older albums while you go for the newer albums, but that's aside the point. I'm right there with you on a lot of different points, particularly how the up-tempo tracks seem to come off a little bit better. I do like a lot of the slower ones too. But really, much like last week, talk about Gang of Youth, I feel this album starts off very hot and then just kind of regresses to the mean. The juxtaposition of this album is kind of all over the place, like you said. And what a shame, too, because I feel like if they had maybe rearranged things a little more or gave the horns a little bit more of a push, this album really could have been an all-time great and maybe made everybody stand up and notice, hey, Tower of Power is a really, really good, talented band. Because they are a really, really good, talented band. And if you are ever at a party that is 70s themed, where people are, wearing afros or leisure suits or, tie-dye garb, this is an immaculate background noise for that. All that to say, I'm going to give this album a 7.5 out of 10.
Oh, okay. So you're actually pretty close within my spectrum too. So,
yeah, I would have given it an 8, but there's too much. I'm thinking to me they held themselves back a little too much for me to give it a full 8. So 7.5 it is.
All right. So that brings the average score between the two of us to 7.25. Because math. So, when it came to the next album recommendation for me, this was something I kind of struggled with a little bit, but I'm going to land with a collaboration album that's a little bit more, well, it's significantly more modern day than this record is. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this record, but Bruno Mars and Anderson .Paak did a record together. And the album is called An Evening with Silk Sonic. Excellent album that has, like, plenty enough, like, soulful ballads, like, funky moments. For those of you who, I'm pretty sure, like, the majority of, like, existence now knows what a Bruno Mars is. If you've experienced a Bruno Mars and you enjoy what he brings to the table, check out that album. And then if you check out that album and you like it, treat yourself to the Tower of Power, man.
And for my recommendation, I thought about giving the next album by Tower of Power a listen, which is Back to Oakland, but I didn't, so I can't recommend that album. So instead, I'm going to recommend another album from the early 70s that tends to fall more into the basic R&B vein and has a lot more tracks I think people are familiar with. And that is the album Backstabbers by the OJs, which features the title track along with Love Train, some other great cuts on there like Listen to the Clock on the Wall and Sunshine. Very much in the standard R&B mold. It's Philly soul, so not quite as horn heavy as Tower of Power, but anyone who basically dug the general vibe of this will dig the general vibe of that as well.
So if you have experienced the Tower of Power album that me and Matt have talked about, please check out both of our recommendations. They're very solid recommendations, and treat yourself to expanding your musical knowledge a little bit more. So, anything else to say about Tower of Power before we pivot over to our next review, my dude?
Not really. Again, I'm glad you appreciate the album. I'm really glad you liked What Is Hip, because, again, if there's no other takeaway from this album, if people are listening, like, I don't know if I really want to listen to this whole album based on what they said. Just, if you're not going to go full tilt with it, just listen to What Is Hip. You will thank us later.
Indeed, my thoughts are the same. Like, excellent record. I would recommend anybody check it out, even if just for the sake of expanding your knowledge and experiencing new things. So, talking about experiencing new things, though, Matthew, are you ready to experience some new things alongside with me?
As sinister as that sounds, yes, I am.
All right, so we're gonna leapfrog several decades into the future with our next review. We're gonna do two albums that are currently, they've been released in the year of our Lord 2024. They are both albums featuring women. They are albums that Anthony Fantano has reviewed. I'm not going to give too many clues away about what his reviews were, because that could perhaps give it away. But I'm going to keep the choosing, the choices, something that I know that you're probably not going to know off the top of your head. I'm just going to cut right to the chase. The way I'm going to have you choose between these two pop female artists and the album that they released this year is, I want you to pick a number. Are you ready?
Go for it.
All right. 7.2 or 8.6.
I'm going to go with 8.6.
All right. So, the album that you have chosen is the album that Anthony Fantano gave his most recent 10 out of 10 on. It's currently in the Billboard 200. I think it's in the top 5 right now, or top 10 at least. It's the album of the summer, at least within like the music, reviewer, the YouTube sphere, from what I'm able to gather. And that album is by Charlie XCX, and the album itself is called Brat.
So I will kind of disappoint you a little bit. I did know that he gave Brat a 10 out of 10. I wasn't sure if that was going to be when you gave those two scores, I wasn't sure if it was sort of a bait and switch, but I was kind of curious as to listen to this album anyway to see if it holds up to the standard that he gave it. And by the way, to give the answer to your trivia question, it is currently number 9 on the Billboard 200, peaked at number 3.
All right, so dude, I'm ready for our next review, man. It's gonna be hot.
It's gonna be a good one.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you've not experienced Brat by Charlie XCX yet, one, treat yourself to the album. A lot of people are digging it, and it's one of the highest rated, highest hyped pop albums of the year so far. And yeah, that being said, if you got to this point of this review here of this episode, and you like what me and Matt bring to the table, and let's face it, I mean, you like what we bring to the table. We bring good content, and you're, listening to me talk right now. But the best way you can support me and Matt talk more about music and albums that we wanted to discuss is that on that podcasting platform of choice, make sure that you subscribe. Follow whatever the action is that you got to do to make sure that you keep up to date with our new episodes. And also on that podcasting platform of choice, if you have the ability to give us a positive rating, that always helps for the algorithms out there. And for those of you who are listening to us on the YouTube sphere, like many YouTubers out there, you know what to do. You gotta subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment below what you felt about the review and the video, like the album as a whole. And yeah, for those of you who are curious about our social media links, they're down in the episode description as a whole. But that being said, for the last time in this episode about me and the other man on this podcast who share the same middle name, climbing a tower in power and discovering what is hip, I am the one, the only, the still will never smoke weed in my lifetime, Ryan James Kearns.
And I am the one, the only, the undisputed Matthew James Durzik.
And, man, sometimes I just get so down about the end of reviews, man, because it's so fun talking music with you, but I knew that the time would come that this would happen, man.
Well, hey, we got a few days before our next reviews, so just give yourself a clean slate.